The men on shore kept the bonfires going strong in the middle of the rough winter weather, the night of the 28th of December, keeping an anxious vigil on the stranded tramp steamer in the distance. Their repeated attempts of rescue had failed so far, beaten back by blinding snow and rough waves. But they wanted the 30 men on the Dremelier to know that they were not alone, so they kept the fires roaring.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have The Dremelier Holds Out Hope?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The British freighter Dremelier left New York Harbor on Christmas morning 1904, loaded with a cargo of copper, oil, pig lead, and steel rails bound for Havre and Swansea. The 2,330-ton steamer would later be estimated to be carrying $600,000 worth of cargo, which was only partially insured. The Dremelier had spent 9 days in New York Harbor, and in spite of the holiday and the swiftly worsening weather, Captain Nicholson decided it was time to go. It was later suspected, though denied, that the crew had indulged in a little holiday cheer, which possibly factored in to the events that follow. Though the weather had already been poor as the ship had left the port, it was about to get much worse. The wind howled, the waves crashed over the ship, and the snow soon reached whiteout conditions. As night fell, the visibility got even worse, and Captain Nicholson was forced to navigate by compass alone. He would later speculate that the steel in his cargo might have thrown off the ship's compass. Considering the poor conditions, it might be considered a lack of judgment that, by his own admission, the Dremelier was traveling at 12 knots. Whether it was the lack of visibility or a compass error. At 3 a.m, the Dremelier's trip was significantly shortened when it came to rest on the bar outside of the Fire Island Inlet on the 26th of December. The men of the local life-saving stations were attentive, and by 5:30 in the morning, a man from the Oak Island life-saving station had spotted the distress signal of the stranded steamer. The Oak Island station quickly telegraphed the Fire Island station, and both stations launched boats to go to the ship's aid. When the crews of the life-saving stations boarded the Dremelier, they found that Captain Nicholson and his crew had no interest in being rescued, in spite of their distress signal. They thanked the life-saving crews for their troubles, but since the weather now seemed as though it was improving, and the Dremelier was in a mud bank and not on rocks, Captain Nicholson expressed confidence that with high tide, his ship would be refloated and they would be on their way. The life-saving crews departed, but before they left, they arranged a series of signals that the Dremelier could fly in case they needed to be removed off of the ship in the future. Captain Nicholson's decision to not abandon ship might have been impacted by the fact that the wrecking tug William E. Chapman was standing nearby waiting for them to leave the ship so that the tug could claim salvage rights. Captain Nicholson's faith in the high tide turned out to be misplaced. Tuesday found the ship still trapped in the mud off of Fire Island, and the wind was even stronger than before, howling out of the northeast. Waves were now crashing over her decks, causing the men on board of her to flee for whatever shelter they could find, either below decks or in the deck cabins. Their chance of escape had come and gone. The surf boat could not be launched in such weather. Their own lifeboats would never survive the storm, and a breach buoy could not be used to bring them to safety since they were too far from the shore. They had chosen to stay on the ship, and now they were trapped on her. At daybreak of Wednesday, the crew of the Dremelier heard a sound that made them think of a cannon from the hold of the ship. Moments later, there was a bulging amidships. It was soon discovered that due to the strain and rocking inflicted on the ship by the heavy waves, the ship's engine had been torn from its fastenings and slid 6 feet. The boiler also broke free and slid in the opposite direction as the engine, but a similar distance. The rivets on the ship sheared off in hundreds from the bulkheads and flew in volleys that the chief engineer compared to rifle bullets. This made it dangerous for the men below decks, who were driven up onto the deck. Water also began to gain in the ship, filling, among other things, the galley, and removing their food supply. The stern buried itself deep into the sand, with the rudder and the propeller quickly going. The Dremelier had broken its back. The Dremelier hoisted its first signal since it had initially asked for assistance. It raised flags to tell those on the shore that a boiler had broke loose. At first, those on shore had assumed that this was a case of a shifting piece of cargo, but then reality dawned. With it came a new concern. There was a chance, with how the ship was being rocked, that the boiler could pound itself through the hull of the ship. This gave a renewed sense of urgency to the life-saving crews on the shore, who decided to make the attempt to reach the Dremelier once again. 2 steam tugs had stood by the wreck for a while, in the hopes of being able to render aid, but the storm drove both of them out to sea. And now it was the turn of the life-saving stations to try to return to the ship that had previously refused their aid. One attempt, early that Wednesday, almost had deadly effects. A lifeboat was loaded with 10 picked men, but once they left the shore, a giant wave not only capsized the small boat, it also smashed it to pieces. The 10 men now found themselves in the water and in need of aid themselves. Luckily, other members of the life-saving crews remained on shore, and they dove into the water with lines around their waists, pulling all 10 of the men back to shore and safety. There were no further attempts to launch lifeboats. It was clear they were not going to be able to reach the Dremelier. At 11:15 in the morning of that Wednesday, a new ship appeared on the scene. The United States revenue cutter Mohawk left her station near Staten Island in the hopes of being able to render aid. For 2 hours, the revenue cutter stood by the stranded Dremelier, hoping for a chance to pull off the survivors. Lieutenant Lariat, the second officer of the Mohawk, would later describe the scene that they had found to the newspapers. We found the vessel lying broadside to the Fire Island shore, about 3/4 of a mile from the inlet, and a similar distance from Bell Buoy No. 8, which had been placed there as a warning signal for the sandbar further in. The steamer had her port side turned to the land, and her bow pointed in a southeasterly direction. She had a list to starboard, and pounded heavily, as one tremendous seize after the other struck her. The Mohawk stopped by the Bell Buoy, heeding its warning, which the Dremelier had failed to see. This placed the Mohawk still 3/4 of a mile from the stranded ship, but close enough to take stock of the situation. Almost immediately, they gave up hope of being able to pull anyone off of the Dremelier, so long as the weather continued as it was. Lieutenant Lariat would say that much of the time they had not even been able to see the Dremelier through the waves that were hitting her, but when they did see her, it was clear that the waves were sweeping her deck, making it life-threatening for anyone to go out on the deck of the ship to be pulled off. Not only that, but the impact of the waves caused the ship to tremble and pound in the sand she was stuck in. The waves were so high that they went over her decks and deck houses entirely and struck her funnel top. They had been able to communicate with those on the Dremelier, though. The Mohawk hoisted a signal asking if there was anyone on board. It did occur to the crew of the cutter that with how the waves were sweeping the deck, there was a chance that the crew was gone. To their relief, the salvage tug, the William E. Chapman, responded to them, signaling that the entire crew of the Dremelier was still on board. Now, the Mohawk lifted up the flags that asked if assistance was needed. This time, the Dremelier was able to respond for itself. After a long delay, A single flag fluttered over the ship. Yes. What could be done was another question, though. The captain of the Mohawk was not going to launch one of his ship's boats when it was certain to be smashed by the waves, and the men in it lost. After 2 hours, they sent a signal to the William E. Chapman, asking if the wrecking tug was going to continue standing by the Dremelier through the night. The Chapman replied they would, with the comfort that there would at least be a ship nearby in case of emergency. The Mohawk returned to its Staten Island anchorage for the night. The waves crashing over the ship were icy, and ice was forming in the rigging that some of the members of the crew had retreated to. The men from the Mohawk, as well as the observers on shore, all felt that while the ship might hold together for a little while longer, it looked as though all of the men on her were doomed. Newspapers even reported as much. All the people on the shore could do was stand by their fires and wait. None of them were aware that at 9:30 that night, Captain Patterson of the Sandy Hook Life-Saving Station had received a telegraph from the New York Inspector's office. It gave him clear orders to once more endeavor to reach the Dremelier. At the time, the New York Times would call the crew the hardiest lifesavers on the coast, and Captain Patterson clearly was willing to take on the challenge, in spite of the danger to himself and his men. As soon as he had received his orders, he telegraphed to hire a tugboat, and the tug, the Catherine Morgan, agreed to take on the job. The newspapers assumed that they would wait until dawn to set out on another rescue attempt. But Captain Patterson and his surfmen launched their largest lifeboat, an unsinkable, self-righting self-bailer, and waited for the tug. The Catherine Morin was on her way up the harbor when the Morin Towing Company intercepted her in the Narrows and redirected her. Captain Deacon of the Catherine Morin seemed eager to help, considering the speed with which he made his way to Sandy Hook. The surfmen and Captain Patterson had been standing with their equipment on the government pier, and as soon as the Catherine Morin arrived, they piled themselves and their equipment on board of her. By 3:30 that morning, the tug was on her way to the open sea, towing the lifeboat behind her, and with a company of 9 men of the life-saving service, including Captain Patterson. The Morin Towing Company would take pride in their tug. The Catherine Morin was a brand new boat, 110 feet long, and considered a sturdy vessel. The moment they rounded the hook, they were faced with the same storm that had thwarted all other rescue attempts, however, and Captain Deacon was in for a fight. The winds were blowing at 40 miles an hour, and even though this wind was coming from almost directly astern, with a large lifeboat in tow, she was not able to travel quickly. The confidence in the Captain Morin turned out to be well-deserved. The same weather that they faced drove back the Robert Palmer, a newspaper tug that had ventured out with a patented device they assured the public would be useful if the Dremelier did break up. The William E. Chapman, the wrecking tug that had been standing by, sent a signal to the crew of the Dremelier at dawn. "Sea going down. We'll take you off during the day. Don't leave in your own boats." 4 flags were hoisted up the mast by the Dremelier in response, which set up a cheer from the crowd on the shore who were watching through telescopes. The signals declared that the ship was in bad condition, but the crew was all right. 3 men appeared on deck and raised another signal. "Send lifeboat, save crew." This was a signal that the Fire Island life-saving crew had been waiting for, and they now mobilized their own lifeboat. Unlike the Sandy Hook station, they had to fight the surf, however, a task that they struggled with for an hour. The Sandy Hook crew, meanwhile, were towed into view, and got as close as the Catherine Morin was comfortable getting. In total, they had traveled 42 miles. Now, the Sandy Hook crew cast off from the tug, knocked off the ice that had formed all over their lifeboat, and started their own battle with the 10-foot-tall waves that were crashing over the Dremelier. The Sandy Hook crew hoisted a small sail, and they were able to round the Dremelier to get into its lee. Here, the sailors on board the Dremelier lowered a ladder. Captain Patterson boarded the ship and asked everyone who wanted to leave the ship to step forward quickly, since the longer they were alongside the ship, the more danger they would be in. At first, 25 of the men on board stepped forward, but on finding that the captain and officers did not step forward, some of them determined not to leave the ship until they did. Among them was one of the ship's boys, who even Captain Nicholson tried to convince to leave with the lifeboat men. The boy refused to leave his post so long as the captain was still on board, though, and there was no time to argue. One by one, men descended the ladder until the bottom rung, and then jumped for the lifeboat. The lifeboat was a constantly moving target, repeatedly seeming to those on shore like it was going to be swamped, though its advertised features were working well and kept it afloat. One by one, they either caught the men who jumped in their direction, or dragged them from the water if they missed the boat. Only 16 of the people on board of the Dremelier, 14 men and 2 boys, elected to go with the Sandy Hook crew, however. With the boat now loaded with 25 people in total, they had a hard struggle back to the Catherine Morin, even though the tug had shifted her position so that they would have the wind at their backs on their row back. Before leaving on the Catherine Morin, Captain Patterson sent one last signal to the Dremelier, asking if they were certain they wanted to remain on the wrecked vessel. The Fire Island crew had already turned back to their station, and even though he and his men were freezing and soaked, they were all willing to return to pull off the rest of the ship's crew. The Dremelier sent no response, though, so the Catherine Morin began her journey back to Sandy Hook. It would take her another 6 hours to reach her destination. Almost as soon as the Sandy Hook crew had left the area, a new flag was hoisted from the Dremelier. Clearly, Captain Nicholson had thought twice about remaining on the Dremelier as it began to break up beneath his feet. The new signal simply said, "Send boats to save crew." The signal was seen by the Fire Island life-saving crew, who set out again, this time accompanied by the Oak Island life-saving crew. The Fire Island crew had learned from their hard battle through the surf before, and this time the crews waded through the icy water of the surf, dragging their boats behind them most of the way to the wreck. It was only once they got into deep water that they took to their boats. The rest of the men on the Dremelier were pulled off by the 2 crews without incident and taken to the Oak Island station to rest and recover. All of them had endured the 100 hours since the wreck without serious injury, and they only showed signs of exhaustion. Captain Nicholson, as befitted a captain, was the last person to leave the wrecked ship. The wrecking tug, the William E. Chapman, had its patience and risk rewarded. The next day, they were able to board the Dremelier and claim the salvage of her cargo. Though they put anchors down to keep her from slipping off of the bank and into the sea, the ship was swiftly breaking up now, and holes were beginning to form in her. Soon, her lighter cargo was floating in the ocean, though the metal remained. The crews of all 3 life-saving stations received commendation letters for their swift actions and bravery in their fight against nature. The newspapers were quick to forgive Captain Nicholson for any fault of steering or judgment he might have had as a flaw of the compass and poor weather. Over the years, the position of the wreck has shifted. Once on the west side of the inlet, she is now on the east side of the same inlet, as the Fire Island inlet has migrated several miles over time. For a long time, her steering quadrant stood to mark where she had wrecked, but this too has gone with time. There is little left to remind anyone of the brave rescue of the crew of the Dremelier.
For more information, please see Annual Report of the United States Life Saving Service for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 1905, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.